In this video, we're going to explore patterns of evolution, in other words, different types of evolution that we can see. Many of them you might already be familiar with, as we've already briefly discussed these terms in previous presentations, or at least briefly discussed the concepts in previous presentations. So the first type of evolution or pattern of evolution that we'll discuss is something called divergent evolution. Divergent evolution is when you have a common ancestor and then a bunch of different species arise from that common ancestor, and they look different from each other because they live in different environments. So you can see over here in Ontario, there's 20 species of closely related rodents, and they look very different from each other because they are in different environments. So that is an example of divergent evolution, where things that are related to each other sort of start to move away from each other over time. There's still, if you were to study homologies, such as molecular homologies or comparative anatomy and development, you would see some striking similarities, but on the outside they will look different because of different environments. And so typically divergent evolution will result in the structures known as analogous structures, which we studied in the evidence of evolution, analogous structures. Oftentimes, divergent evolution can lead to what's called adaptive radiation. Adaptive radiation is where a single species will evolve into a number of distinct but closely related species. So we have a common ancestor, and then you have a whole bunch of different species that arise from that common ancestor, and they look different because, again, they're in different environments. This is a special case of divergent evolution. There's essentially a lot of species that arise from a single one in a relatively short amount of time. And when I say a short amount of time, I don't mean one day, but a short amount of time on an evolutionary timeline. So we can see over here there's 13 species of Darwin finches, and they arose from a single common ancestor as they accumulated differences on their different environments. So some of their beaks were more fit for certain environments than other beaks. So for example, a larger beak depth might be better to crack some harder seeds to get to the food than a smaller beak. A narrow beak might be better for an island where you have to reach into small cracks or crevices to get your food. But the idea is that this is adaptive radiation, a special case of divergent evolution where many species arise from a single common ancestor in a relatively short amount of time. So here we can see some examples of an example of divergent evolution in the Pokemon world. So you can take a look at this being let's just say it was the parent species or the common ancestor, and over time, due to being in different environments, it split into several different closely related species, but they're different from each other because they are in different environments. Now, here's a good reflection question to think about. So these different species, they look different from each other, yet they are closely related. Now, they look different because they're in different environments, but what could you do to support the idea that they are closely related to each other? If you were an evolutionary biologist studying these organisms, what type of evidence would you provide, would you look for to show that they are all closely related to each other? So with divergent evolution, there's a few predictable outcomes that you can make. Because the ancestral species diverges into many different forms, those different forms will live in different areas. So A might live in a different area from B, which might live in a different area from C. And since they live in different areas, that will reduce competition in those environments. They'll be partitioning or splitting up where they're living rather than fighting for one particular environment. So when divergent evolution occurs, you usually see a reduction in competition between species because they're occupying different niches, different, let's say, locations and different lifestyles. They're not bumping into each other all the time. So the idea is that as long as there's resources that can be used, new species will continue to arise. So if there's a tree somewhere that doesn't have a habitat, one day there may be a mutation that leads to a bird that might live in this tree, and benefit from living in this tree, and that might become a different species altogether. So as long as there's new habitats and new niches available, you'll probably continue to see some divergent evolution from closely related organisms. Overall, divergent evolution leads to an increase in biodiversity. So if all the birds remain the same, they would have been at risk of going extinct, especially if there was some sudden change in the environment, since there were no differences in the population. But now all these birds look different from each other. If there's a sudden catastrophe in the environment, some may survive and continue and allow the species to continue surviving, or the different species to continue surviving. Another type of evolution is called convergent evolution. We've seen this before, where distantly related organisms start to look more like each other. So if you take a look at the shark and the dolphin, they look very similar to each other despite being distantly related. We studied the phylogenetic tree with the cat and the dolphin being more closely related to each other than the dolphin is to the shark. And we were able to determine that because if you were to cut the dolphin open and the cat open, you would see similar homologous features, and if you studied DNA, you'd see more closely resembling DNA structures and protein structures. But the reason the shark and the dolphin look so different despite being distantly related, look so similar despite being distantly related, is because they live in similar environments and they have similar selective pressures. So here we have an interesting quote that relates to convergent evolution. And I want you to think about it before we go on to the next slide to try to explain what this quote means. It's from your textbook, and so it's important to try to understand what you're actually reading rather than gloss over things if you don't get them. So while some traits will converge in form and function, each species will retain other features that provide evidence of their distinct evolutionary past. So think about what that means. Maybe pause the video for a minute and come up with an answer. So once you have an answer, come back and check with me. But essentially it's the idea that even though these two organisms have converged, they look very similar to each other despite being distantly related. If you were to look deep down, there's some features that will show you that they're actually not closely related to each other anymore. You'd see very different structures in terms of their maybe embryology, in terms of their DNA or their amino acid structure. So it's the idea that organisms that might look similar because of similar environments will still have proof or evidence that they came from distantly related organisms or common ancestors. So just like with divergent evolution, there are some predictions or predictable outcomes that can be made from convergent evolution. So the first is that natural selection is going to favor the evolution of similar traits in similar environments. So we have streamlined structures for swimming because these organisms are both in aquatic environments. And then the other predictable outcome, which I mentioned on the previous slide, is that even though these two organisms will converge in many of their body parts, there'll still be some evidence left over to show that they're not actually that closely related. So that evidence will be homologous structures that would be very, very different between these two organisms here, deep down, especially DNA and amino acids in protein structure, just to show that, again, they're not as closely related as we might think. They just look similar because of the similar environments. Another type of evolution is something called coevolution. Coevolution is when two species evolve in response to each other. So one species will evolve in response to the evolution of another species. It's important to understand that this is not convergent evolution. In convergent evolution, for example, the dolphin did not start to look the way it did because the shark started to look the way it did. They just happen to look like each other because of a similar environment. But in convergent evolution, you can kind of think of it in a way like peer pressure. So one peer influences a change in the other peer, and maybe vice versa. So over here, we can see the example of a mammal called an agouti. It has developed some extremely strong teeth and jaws, as its Brazil nut tree has developed an extremely hard casing to protect its seeds. And as the extremely hard casing became harder in the plants, These organisms were favored by natural selection if they had stronger teeth and stronger jaws to break over these extremely hard casings. And that kind of happened over and over again in a cycle. So as natural selection favored harder casing to protect seeds of the plants, the natural selection then favored the stronger jaws and teeth to break the harder casing that was favored in the plants. So these two organisms or species co-evolved. In a way, we can think of this like an evolutionary arms race, where they were evolving to get the strongest weapons so that none of them would be wiped out. Another example is the hawk moth and the Madagascar long-spurred orchid. So what was interesting is that the hawk moth is essentially the only organism that will pollinate flowers of the orchid. And so over time, the orchid developed this very long spur, basically a tube where the nectar, which the hawk moth likes to feed on, is located. And so the spur is so long that natural selection seemed to favor hawk moths with longer tongues to reach the nectar at the end of that spur. Now, the reason that orchids may have developed a long spur is thought it's because it would force hawk moths to spend a longer time on the flower and therefore be more likely to pick up pollen. But the idea is that as orchids developed longer spurs and evolved that over time, natural selection favored the evolution of hawk moths with long tongues to reach that. And so this hawk moth evolved in response to the longer spurs of the orchid. And then the orchid evolved the longer spurs in response to hawk moths that would spend more time on them to get pollen, and then as a result pass on those genes to the pollen. So when a plant is pollinated, it's essentially gametes being transferred from one plant to another to make babies. So here what we see again are two examples of coevolution, two organisms evolving in response to each other. A very interesting case of coevolution is something called Batesian mimicry. I just want to emphasize before we move on to this example that coevolution is not convergent evolution. Coevolution is when two organisms are evolving in response to each other. Convergent evolution is simply when organisms start to look alike because of similar environments, but they're not necessarily evolving in response to each other. The dolphin is not evolving because the shark is evolving, they just have similar structures because they both live in aquatic environments. Batesian mimicry is a really cool example of coevolution, but it's a bit different. Here we have a wasp, and here we have a hoverfly. Now, the wasp can sting you, it is very dangerous, and it can harm organisms, but the hoverfly is harmless. Now, many of us, if we see this hoverfly, we might think that it's a wasp, and if you're scared of getting stung, you might run away from this hoverfly. And other organisms act that way as well. When they see this hoverfly here, even though it's harmless, they think it's a wasp. So this is called Batesian mimicry, where this organism, some of the organisms in the environment just were born with mutations that made them look like wasps, and those ones for some reason survived longer and reproduced. And the reason they probably survived and reproduced is because organisms and predators thought they were wasps, and so they survived, reproduced, passed on their genes, and so now these hoverflies look like wasps as a result of that. Now, the reason that this is not convergent evolution is because the wasp is not changing in response to the hoverfly. It was more so that the hoverfly just started to look like the wasp over time. And we call that mimicry because it's as if it was trying to copy the wasp. Now, it wasn't purposeful. This happened by chance, of course, a natural selection acting, but we still call it mimicry as if they were trying to copy each other. This would actually be an example of something called advergent evolution, where the selective pressures cause one organism to look similar to another, but the other organism doesn't really care about the one that's starting to look like it. Basically, only one organism is changing its appearance to mimic the other. The other doesn't even realize it's happening. So that's an example of advergent evolution. This specific example is Batesian mimicry. It's the idea that a non-toxic organism will start to resemble a non-toxic or harmless organism will start to resemble a dangerous, poisonous, or toxic organism, and as a result of that, predators will be scared of it, and it will continue to look more and more like the dangerous organism. And lastly, we have something called cumulative selection. And the greatest example of that is the evolution of the eye. The eyes in humans especially are very, very complex structures. And people for the longest time had no idea how to explain the evolution of such complex structures under the current theory of evolution by natural selection. But today we know of the idea of cumulative selection, where you have a simple structure, and through a series of small adaptations over many, many, many years, it can become something more and more complex. So this diagram here illustrates the evolution of the eye from a simple form to the very, very complex form that we may see today. So to learn more about the evolution of the eye and the idea of cumulative selection, please watch this video over here. And again, cumulative meaning many changes occurring over a number of years to create a more complex structure. Here are the practice problems for this PowerPoint. You have the associated reading from pages 341 to 345, and these practice questions are a great summary of the concepts that we've seen in this PowerPoint. Again, the associated readings can be found here. At this point, we finished Chapter 8 in the evolution unit, so you should be preparing for your test, which will cover Chapter 8, Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, all the learning goals within, including Hardy-Weinberg equations and cladograms and phylogenetic trees. The test structure will look something like this: multiple choice, short answer, maybe some definitions in there, and also some diagrams.